The Vice Lord Nation became one of the largest street organizations in the United States, spreading into nearly every state, city, and town. Over time, their name carried power, not just because of drugs or violence, but because of the vision that once fueled their rise. Many outsiders saw only the crime, but at its core, the Vice Lord Nation began as something else entirely, a movement born from frustration, unity, and survival. There was a time when even the government believed in them, when programs and support flowed in, and for a brief moment, the Vice Lords became a positive force on Chicago's west side. In North Lawndale, they gave hope to young men who had nowhere else to turn. Bobby Gore's name echoes through that early history. In his writings and in the accounts written about him, he never mentioned a group called the Vice Lords before the Almighty Vice Lords were formed. For years, people believed the name stretched back to the 1940s, and many dismissed those claims as myth until the pieces began to align. Gore's story, told in A Nation of Lords, the autobiography of the Vice Lords, connected directly to those legends. He was part of a youth baseball team called the Baby Dragons on Chicago's near west side. Gore was born in 1936, growing up around Halsted and Maxwell. By 1945, the Baby Dragons were scrapping in the streets over ball games, and as the boys got older, they renamed themselves the Vikings. Something tougher, more fitting for the neighborhood's changing tone. It was during those years that Bobby Gore met a small club near Roosevelt and Racine in the Maxwell Street Market area. They called themselves the Vice Lords. The neighborhood was shifting, Jewish families were moving out and black families were moving in, but even as the demographics changed, ownership did not. Jewish landlords and shop owners still controlled nearly everything, the stores, the buildings, the blocks. African Americans, despite being the new majority, were shut out from owning property, trapped by redlining and economic barriers. In that environment, the early Vice Lords weren't criminals. They were young black men coming together to protect and support one another. They weren't on police radars, weren't in newspapers, and weren't known for violence. Bobby Gore, then a Viking, even designed their leather jackets, the ones with Vice Lords stitched across the back. They believed in unity and brotherhood and building something of their own. Though little documentation survives, it's likely these early Vice Lords passed down their beliefs to Gore himself. If one had to name a founding year, 1947 fits best. The same year, the original Egyptian Cobras, then known as the Impressionist Cobras, formed in that same part of Chicago. Gore was just 11 years old. By 1951, Bobby Gore's family had moved west to North Lawndale, a neighborhood then filled mostly with Jewish and white residents. Gore still made trips back to Maxwell Street to see friends until those same friends began moving to Lawndale too. The Egyptian Cobras followed the same path, evolving from the Impressionist Cobras to the Oasis Cobras, and finally settling as the Egyptian Cobras. Around that time, the original Vice Lords also moved into Lawndale, and that's where future Almighty Vice Lord Nation founder Edwin Peepelow Perry first learned of them, but by the late 1950s, those first Vice Lords were gone. North Lawndale itself was collapsing from the inside. Around 1955, predatory slumlords swept in. Names like Mo Foreman, Al Berlin, Joseph Berkey, Lou Wolfe, and Gilbert Blinn. They bought up nearly all the rental properties and charged sky-high rents for crumbling apartments they refused to maintain. Black families migrating from the South in search of a better life had nowhere else to go. White neighborhoods still resisted integration even after legal housing covenants were lifted. The result was a human trap. Overcrowded buildings, failing infrastructure, no heat, and poverty pressing down on every block. Businesses closed, buildings decayed, and crime surged. Outsiders preyed on the community. Hate crimes weren't rare, they were constant. Families gathered around old wood-burning stoves for warmth. Children played in alleys because there were no parks, and young men grew restless. With no jobs, no recreation, and no hope, street life became the only outlet. Neighborhood clubs transformed into street gangs. The Imperial Chaplains and the Clovers were among the first, soon followed by newer, more aggressive groups like the Egyptian Cobras, who had now migrated from Maxwell Street to Lawndale. By the late 1950s, it became nearly impossible for a young black boy to grow up in Lawndale without joining a gang. Public spaces were owned by street crews. If you went to the park, the pool, the theater, even the corner store, you were in someone's territory. Refusing to join could mean getting jumped, or worse. Many didn't choose a gang because they wanted to, they did it because it was the only way to exist safely in their own neighborhood. The choice came down to location and interest, who ruled your block, where you liked to hang out, or which crew controlled your favorite park. By 1957, violence had escalated. Fists turned to knives, knives to guns. The Clovers ruled North Lawndale, with the Egyptian Cobras growing fast behind them. Both gangs even held power back in the Maxwell Street area. The Chicago police took notice, and in March 1957, Fillmore District Captain Thomas J. O'Donnell launched a sweeping crackdown on black gangs across the West Side. Officers raided homes, rounded up youths, and beat them in custody. Many were burned with cigarettes, whipped with belts, or punched in the face. That spring, it all came to a head with the James Halsell case. Halsell, a member of the Clovers, was arrested for a minor offense but brutally beaten for 6 hours by police. The story caught the attention of the ACLU, the FBI, and the Chicago Youth Center's executive board. Investigations were launched, but nothing changed. The sweeps continued into 1958. Young men kept getting locked up, and many ended up in juvenile detention. By then, the streets of North Lawndale had transformed completely. Poverty, police brutality, and gang wars had rewritten the neighborhood's identity. For the young and the forgotten, the streets weren't just a danger, they were home. In the late 1950s, the streets of Chicago were changing, and so was a 15-year-old kid named Edwin Pepolo Perry. Between 1957 and 1958, police sweeps across the city pulled in dozens of young offenders. Among them was Pepolo and his small crew, the Phantom Burglars, arrested for a string of break-ins. They were sent to the Illinois Youth Center in St. Charles, a reformatory meant to correct boys, but often ended up shaping them into something else entirely. Pepolo's story didn't begin there though. At 14, he'd already walked away from home, choosing the streets over structure. Burglary became his trade, and his name started to carry weight. Ambitious and bold, he wanted more than just crime. He wanted a seat among the city's organized outfits. He approached Big John, leader of the powerful Imperial Chaplains, but was met with a cold dismissal. "We don't want no punk motherfucker in the organization." For a boy who stood 6'1", 190 pounds, and could fight with both speed and strength, it was an insult that burned deep. Big John's rejection would unknowingly shape the birth of one of Chicago's most notorious street nations. Inside the reformatory, Pep was assigned to Harding Cottage, and there he reconnected with a familiar face, Leonard Cal Calloway, another kid from the neighborhood. Cal was already part of the Imperial Chaplains and once tried to sponsor Pep's membership before Big John's rejection. Now both found themselves behind the same institutional walls. But Pep wasn't just another inmate, he had a natural authority. He was known for keeping new arrivals in line and quickly gained a reputation as a leader and fighter. Soon he maneuvered to have Cal transferred into his cottage, where they reunited under a new vision. At Harding, they linked up with another chaplain, Ernest Wren, along with Ralph Toholt Bonds, Maurice Miller, and a couple of others whose names faded from history. Of the 7, only Cal and Wren came from existing gangs, but together, Pep organized them, not as a clique, but as something tighter, more disciplined. They began running crucial institutional jobs, controlling the butcher area, the kitchen, and the linens. In a place where food and clothing meant power, they quietly ruled the reformatory. Staff barely noticed. To them, it was just work assignments. But inside those walls, these boys were building a hierarchy, one that would soon extend to the streets. At first, they had no name, but power demands identity, and Pep knew they needed one. The group began holding meetings twice a week, solidifying their sense of purpose. Pep wanted more than a club, he wanted a gang, one that could command respect when they got out. Maurice Miller suggested the conservative lads, imagining it as a social group. Pep liked the conservative part, but thought they needed a tougher edge. Searching for meaning, he looked up the word vice. It meant to grip tightly, not let go. To Pep, it symbolized strength and control, and so they became vice lords, lords who would never release their grip. The name wasn't entirely new. Vice lords had appeared decades earlier in American crime lore, even used in newspapers to describe elements of the Italian Mafia. But Pep and his brothers claimed it for their own. Cal and Wren wanted to pay homage to their roots, suggesting imperial vice lords. Pep, however, was still carrying that old wound from Big John. He refused to tie his new identity to the Chaplains in any way, and so they settled on conservative vice lords. It wouldn't last long. Most street kids couldn't pronounce conservative, and soon they simply became known as the Vice Lords. By the fall of 1958, the boys began returning to the streets. Maurice Miller was released first and promised to spread word of the new organization, but the full force of the Vice Lords wouldn't hit until all 7 founders were free. Chicago's gang landscape had shifted during their time inside. The once dominant Clovers had been hammered by police raids, allowing a rising group, the Egyptian Cobras, to take control east of K-Town. The Clovers and Imperial Chaplains were still strong, each boasting hundreds of members, but the hierarchy was unstable. Into that power vacuum stepped the 7 Vice Lords, small in number but armed with something the others lacked: organization, loyalty, and purpose. Once Pep was out, he wasted no time expanding his ranks. He brought in close allies: Sun, Trip, Green, and Green's cousin, Sloop, growing the crew to 11. They weren't yet recruiting from the streets, preferring to move as a tight, disciplined unit. To gain attention, they hosted dances, threw parties, and drew crowds. That's where the first major confrontation came. During one of their parties, 4 Clovers showed up and tensions exploded. The Vice Lords beat the 4 back, but soon, dozens more Clovers arrived, 50, maybe 60 deep. Outnumbered and cornered, the Vice Lords fought hard but were forced to scatter. It wasn't a loss that broke them, it was one that pushed them to evolve. From that night on, the Clovers became their first official enemies, and Pep knew what had to be done: grow or disappear. They chose to grow. Their first move was strategic: take out a smaller gang to build strength. Their target was the Barons, a 24-man outfit operating around Farragut High School. Pep started a humbug, a street fight designed to test dominance. Over the next week, the Vice Lords battled the Barons again and again, always outnumbered but never backing down. Eventually, the Vice Lords folded, agreeing to flip and join the Vice Lords. Their numbers jumped from a handful to 35, and their name began to spread across North Lawndale. What began as 7 boys in a reformatory cottage was now a growing street army, united by defiance, driven by loyalty, and bound by the grip of a word that meant power: Vice. By the end of 1958, the Vice Lords had already earned a name on the streets, but they weren't done climbing. Their next challenge came in the form of the Van Dykes, another well-established gang. The war between them raged for 2 days, fists and pipes clashing in alleys and vacant lots across North Lawndale. It ended in a way no one could have predicted when the Van Dykes leader discovered that his own brother had joined the Vice Lords and risen to the rank of vice president. Blood was thicker than pride, and the war stopped cold. By the year's end, the Van Dykes flipped, adding their strength to the growing Vice Lord nation. Going into 1959, the Vice Lords were becoming a name everyone in Chicago's West Side knew, whether through whispers or bruises. That year marked a turning point. The gang's numbers swelled, and they took on multiple enemies at once, including the mighty Egyptian Cobras, who dominated the pools, parks, and theaters. The Cobras had the crowds, the girls, and the spotlight. The Vice Lords wanted all of it. Street corners became battlegrounds, and day after day, Pepolo Perry's name spread across the neighborhoods like wildfire. Alongside the Cobras, they also went to war with the Comanches, the Imperial Chaplains, and a group called the Continental Pimps. What made the Vice Lords different was their isolationist code. They didn't do alliances, they didn't share turf. Pep laid down one rule: if another gang wanted peace, they'd have to take on the Vice Lord name. No exceptions. Most refused that ultimatum at first. But as the Vice Lords fought and absorbed, many of those same gangs eventually collapsed, their members flipping to join the nation they once resisted. By now, Vice Lord recruitment had turned into something far more aggressive than any other crews. It wasn't about earning your way in anymore, it was about surviving the offer. They would approach kids or even small groups and give them a choice: join or take a beating. If someone refused, they'd get a whipping, a public and brutal beating that could stretch across days until they gave in. On the West Side, gangs had always enforced their presence, but none did it like the Vice Lords. It didn't matter if you were in another gang or just standing on the wrong corner. If you were breathing, you were fair game. Inside, the Vice Lords turned even reformatories into strongholds. They dominated the Illinois Youth Center so completely that anyone who wasn't a Vice Lord became a target. When Pep found himself locked up again, word reached him that an Imperial chaplain named Boches had beaten his girlfriend in public. Pep asked one question: which arm did he use? When he got the answer, he said he was going on a week-long vacation and he'd be bringing that arm back with him. When Pep got out, he gathered his crew and went hunting. Their first attempt to ambush the Chaplains failed. Too many enemies, not enough numbers. But soon after, word spread that nearly 300 Chaplains were gathered at the Central Park Theater at Roosevelt Road and Central Park Avenue. Pep led 50 men to confront them, but as they marched, only 12 stayed by his side. It didn't matter that theater, 12 vice lords went toe-to-toe with nearly 90 chaplains. The fight was chaos, fists, knives, and broken seats flying, but the vice lords held their ground, forcing the chaplains back into the streets. When the chaplains regrouped and caught Ren, Pep's men refused to leave him behind. They charged back in, fighting again inside the same theater. That's when Pep found Beauchest. Together with McLamore, he pinned him down and began carving him up, slashing his body, marking his back with the letter CVL, and cutting deep into the arm that had struck his girl. The police stormed in before they could finish, and Pep was arrested, his legend sealed. Beauchest survived, his arm stitched back on. But when word of what Pep had done reached the Illinois Youth Center, every chaplain inside flipped to Vice Lord. In a single act of vengeance, Pep had destroyed the gang that once rejected him, and got even with Big John too. As 1959 rolled on, the Vice Lord's image became as powerful as their reputation. They had a look now, one that demanded respect. Black capes with gold lettering, top hats, gloves, bow ties, and canes. The cane itself was engraved with CVL, and the skull wearing a hat and smoking a cigarette became their emblem. Maurice Calloway came up with the design, and soon the look spread through the West Side. The Vice Lords weren't just feared, they were admired, even envied. The cape wasn't just style, it was function. It hit shotguns, and that's exactly why police started banning them in public. By the end of the year, they ruled the streets after dark. The bandits and Spanish counts were dismantled, their members scattered or converted. The Vice Lords imposed a curfew, 9 p.m. sharp. Any gang caught outside after that time paid in blood. Only Vice Lords roamed the night. They didn't need to claim blocks or corners, the streets themselves were theirs. Police couldn't pin them down. Their movement shifted daily, and unlike other gangs, they never tired of fighting. War wasn't a risk, it was the rhythm of their lives. Their only fixed point was their meeting spot at 2135 South Millet, the heart of North Lawndale. In 1960, Pep was released again, now 17 and more determined than ever. He returned to find one of his own, Possum, had defected to the Morphines. Negotiations failed and war followed. Through the freezing Chicago winter, Vice Lords fought until the Morphines surrendered. Possum and the rest of the Morphine leadership flipped, dissolving the gang entirely, but Pep wasn't finished. The next targets were the Cherokees, who controlled the area around Theodore Herzl School and 16th Street. They were tough, proud, but not enough to withstand the Vice Lords' relentless assaults. After a series of brutal clashes, the Cherokees fell, their territory taken, and most members converted. Some who refused fled to join the Imperial Knights, but Pep's crew was already coming for them next. For a month, the Vice Lords pounded the Knights until every last one surrendered and took the name. Then came the Braves. One of the largest remaining gangs spread through the ABLA and Henry Horner housing projects. For 3 months, war raged across the near West Side. The Braves fought hard but eventually broke, and the Vice Lords took everything they had. By the end of 1960, only one major rival remained: the Egyptian Cobras. The Vice Lords had expanded beyond North Lawndale, planting flags in the near West Side, East Garfield Park, and inside both the ABLA and Henry Horner projects. They had grown from 7 boys in a reformatory into an empire of hundreds, ruling Chicago's West Side through power, fear, and an unbreakable grip of their name: the Vice Lords. By 1960, the west side of Chicago was painted in 2 colors, the black and gold of the Vice Lords and the green of their fiercest rivals, the Egyptian Cobras. The Cobras wanted North Lawndale, the Vice Lords wanted them gone, not just from the neighborhood, but from the entire West Side. When the Cobras refused Pep Perry's ultimatum to leave, the streets erupted into chaos. It was a brutal war, fought not with strategy but with rage. During one of the brawls, Pep stabbed a Cobra lieutenant in the neck, a move that made him both feared and hunted. The lieutenant called the cops, and at 17, Pep was tried as an adult and sentenced to 6 months in Cook County Jail. With their leader locked up, the Vice Lords took heavy losses. The Cobras pushed back hard, reclaiming streets and exacting revenge. Then came the killing that would change everything. During a street fight, Cobra gunfire ripped through the chaos, killing 16-year-old Dee, one of the youngest Vice Lord leaders. His death hit deep, a kid barely old enough to shave, now lying dead on the pavement. Inside his cell, Pep heard the news. He didn't cry. He gave orders, when I get out they better be softened up, and his men listened. The Vice Lord struck back with a vengeance. They shot Stump Daddy's brother Popeye, leaving him bleeding in the street. They cracked another Cobra's skull, Hershey Foster, with a concussion so bad he barely survived. And when they found Leroy Brown, one of the Cobra leaders, they stabbed him 42 times, sending a message written in blood. By the time Pep walked free again, the war had flipped. The Cobras were broken, bruised, cautious, retreating. The Vice Lords owned North Lawndale, but peace was never part of the plan. While Pep was locked up again, the Imperial Chaplains, a gang the Vice Lords had crushed years before, started rebuilding. Pep wasn't the kind of man to let that slide. The Lords stormed a YMCA dance, tearing through the building, smashing windows and flipping tables. When the cops were called, they didn't stop. They moved to Franklin Benjamin Park, destroying a pool hall, burning furniture, and wrecking a nearby restaurant. It wasn't just rage, it was domination. The police finally called Pep again, and this time the judge wanted to make an example. 1 year in Cook County Jail, but jail never stopped Pep. It only gave him a new arena to rule. Inside he was a storm. He fought constantly, so much that guards isolated him, then eventually threw him into the adult side of the jail, thinking he'd calm down among grown men. They were wrong. The first man who tried to test him got beaten not once, but 3 times. Soon, Pep's name carried weight in the adult block. He worked in the kitchen, then decided he wasn't anymore, and neither would any Vice Lord. Overnight, they controlled every work detail in the jail. They ate first, dressed better, and slept in the best bunks. Everyone else, even older men, stepped aside. That kind of power spreads fast. Inmates from other gangs flipped, trading old colors for the Vice Lord's gold. And when they got out, they brought that allegiance back to the streets. The gang wasn't just growing, it was spreading like wildfire, inside and outside the walls. Pep was so connected that he pulled off something unheard of. He escaped. He slipped out disguised, leaving behind a lookalike who played his role for 3 months. When Pep's sentence was up, guards released the double, thinking it was him. No one ever found out. Inside the system, the Vice Lords had turned the jails into their own empire. They traded information through toilets and vents, sending coded messages between floors. Even some jail staff helped pass notes and numbers too scared to say no, because most of them lived on the west side, where Vice Lords ruled the streets. When Pep finally walked out again in 1961, his nation was thriving. His right-hand man, Sugarcane, had turned chaos into structure. The Vice Lords weren't just fighting anymore, they were earning. Protection rackets spread across the west side. Store owners, restaurant managers, and drug dealers paid for insurance, a few dollars to keep the Lords off their backs. Some members robbed stores or sent girls to steal from department shops, selling clothes on the corners for fast cash. They weren't just a gang anymore, they were becoming a business. Pep himself became a figure of influence. If someone wanted to open a business in Vice Lord territory, they came to him first, but that power came with new enemies, ones much older and deadlier than street gangs. On October 2, 1961, someone knocked at the Vice Lord clubhouse door on Miller Street. A gunman fired into the chest of Glenn Miles, a Vice Lord chief. The bullet wasn't meant for him, it was meant for Pep. Word spread fast. The hit came from the Italian Mafia, who saw the Vice Lords as a threat to their control of Chicago's underworld. When police arrived, they found an arsenal, shotguns, automatics, scoped rifles. Pep was arrested again, accused of killing his own man. The syndicate plan crumbled. The Mafia had sent a warning, stay in your lane. The Vice Lords backed off organized crime, but they didn't stop hustling. Instead, they found faster money. They ran car theft rings, collected boxes of keys, and learned to steal any model on the street. Some cars were chopped for parts, others sold whole, and many were used for drive-bys or robberies. By the early 60s, the Vice Lords had become something entirely new, a machine that ran on violence, loyalty, and profit. The police couldn't contain them, the Mafia couldn't control them, and the city of Chicago was learning what it meant to live under the reign of the Vice Lords. A brotherhood born behind bars, built on blood and fueled by the streets. In the early 1960s, the Vice Lords were no longer just a neighborhood crew. They were a tactical army. Their war counselor, Leonard Calloway, ran strategy like a battlefield general. He drew maps, marked escape routes, gangways, rooftops, even doorways. Every inch of enemy turf was studied. The Vice Lords didn't fight blindly. They fought with precision. They moved like guerrilla soldiers, hit fast, hit hard, and vanish. By 1961, they had declared open season on the Egyptian Cobras and Imperial Chaplains. Anyone caught wearing a rival sweater was fair game. The Lord stripped those sweaters off and stockpiled them, hundreds of them. Then one night, they crashed a party packed with Cobras and Chaplains. Every Vice Lord in the room wore one of those stolen sweaters, blending right in. When the music hit its peak, the lights went out, shotgun blasts shattered the ceiling, and chaos erupted. In the dark, the Lords beat and shot their enemies, throwing the jukebox down the stairs as screams echoed through the building. When the lights came back on, Cobras and Chaplains didn't know who was friend or foe. After that night, none of them dared wear their colors again. Fear was a weapon, and the Vice Lords mastered it. That same year, after destroying the Chaplains at the YMCA, something unexpected happened. The entire Imperial Chaplain gang surrendered and flipped. They joined the Lords, becoming the Imperial Vice Lords, the first official branch under the Vice Lord Nation. It was the beginning of something bigger, a structure that would one day stretch across the entire city. By early 1962, the Vice Lords had expanded far beyond Lawndale. Reports started coming out of Cabrini Green, Chicago's massive housing project on the near North Side, about young lords recruiting residents by the dozens. That year, a 17-year-old named Alfonso House Jr., tied to the Vice Lords, shot and killed a peanut vendor right in the complex. It was a sign that the gang had arrived for real. They set up base between 500 and 502 North Oak Street, a spot that came to be known as Bank Road. Soon, Cabrini turned into a war zone. The Vice Lords battled Disciples and Mickey Cobras for control of the red brick towers. Shots cracked from rooftops, snipers picked off rivals through shattered windows. The 500 to 502 Oak buildings became a fortress, until years later when the city tore them down. But the Lords didn't stop there. That same year, they pushed into Wicker Park. At the time, a white working class neighborhood ruled by Greaser gang, they found a small black enclave near Bell and Leavitt, toughened by years of fighting for survival. That's where the Evergreen and Hoying branch was born, one that would later become known as the Conservative Vice Lords. They fought off the white gangs, the United Neighborhoods, the Insane Unknowns, the Spanish Lords, and the Warlords, and held their ground with a mix of charm, unity, and firepower. As the Lords rose, not everyone stayed loyal. By 1963, the original structure was slipping. The older members spent more time in bars drinking than in the streets leading. One of their own, Eugene Brown, broke away to form the Roman Saints. They teamed up with the Cobras to survive, but it didn't matter. The Vice Lords crushed them anyway. Then came 1964, a turning point. The Vice Lords had grown into thousands, too large for one man to control. Edwin "Pep" Perry, now 21, stepped down from active leadership to focus on his family, though he still moved quietly behind the scenes. His replacement was a 29-year-old named Alfonso Alfred. Older, disciplined, and charismatic, Alfred had joined late, but his maturity made him a natural fit. He spent money on his members, took them on trips, helped them find jobs. For the first time, someone tried to give the Vice Lords direction. That same year, the Lords built bonds with the Blackstone Rangers on the Southside, later known as the Black P-Stones. It wasn't just business, it was family. Ranger founders Jeff Fort and Eugene Hairston were related to Vice Lord leaders Leonard Calloway and Bobby Gore. Together, they began shaping what would become Chicago's two most powerful black street nations. But the biggest transformation came one night in July 1964. Pep, Gore, Alfred, Calloway, and J.W. sat drinking wine on 16th Street, tossing bottles into empty lots. Around them, younger lords bragged about beating enemies who had already begged for mercy. The older ones looked at the wreckage of their neighborhood, the boarded up buildings, the broken glass, the fear they'd created, and realized they'd destroyed the very place they came from. That night, something changed. They decided the Vice Lords could be more than chaos. They could rebuild what they'd torn down. And in that moment, they rebranded, becoming the Conservative Vice Lords. By the end of 1964, the CVLs claimed a defined headquarters for the first time, the intersection of 16th and Lawndale and North Lawndale. From there, they began acting less like conquerors and more like protectors. They mediated peace, stopped senseless wars, and even made peace with the Egyptian Cobras. They started patrolling their own streets, watching over businesses, acting like neighborhood guardians. But reform wasn't easy. The police still treated them like thugs. Jobs were scarce and poverty crushed the West Side. The Lords realized the only real solution was economic, building businesses that could hire their own people, bringing money and pride back to the community. By then, the Vice Lords had splintered into multiple factions, branches named after their streets and neighborhood. There were the Congress Vice Lords, Kesey Albany Terribles, Maypole Vice Lords, Madison Vice Lords, and dozens more. In the reorganization of 1964, these groups took on stronger individual identities. 26 factions in total, each operating almost independently. Among them rose the Traveling Vice Lords, Renegade Vice Lords, Warlords, Village Vice Lords, Seven Crown Syndicate, and Chocolate Corner. Together, they were no longer a single gang, they were a nation, a federation of crews that would soon influence everything from the streets to city politics. The Vice Lords had evolved, from street brawlers to strategists, from killers to kings, and their empire was only getting started. In 1965, change began to ripple through Chicago's West Side. George T. Sims Jr., a respected black officer, was appointed commander of the Fillmore District, the first African American ever to hold that position. For the older Vice Lords, this appointment felt like an opening, a way to shift the narrative of who they were and what they could become. They reached out to Sims, expressing their desire to move away from the violence that had long defined the streets of North Lawndale. They wanted his guidance, his suggestions, and maybe even his blessing to steer the next generation away from the chaos that had consumed them for years. And slowly, the neighborhood began to feel that change. By 1966, the Vice Lords' new mission was starting to draw attention. They began to work alongside the Egyptian Cobras, the Black P-Stones, and the Black Disciples, not as enemies, but as partners in a shared effort to bring stability to their communities. That summer, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago, choosing to stay in North Lawndale as he organized protests during the explosive West Side riots. His plan was bold, to march through the white neighborhoods of the Southside as an act of peaceful defiance. The Vice Lords, the Disciples, and the Stones stood ready to join him. But when one of King's aides dismissed them as gangbangers, the streets turned silent. Edwin Pep Perry raised his hand once, a quiet signal, and every gang member withdrew. Hours later, Dr. King himself summoned Pep, Bobby Gore, and several leaders to his residence. He made it clear that the remark did not reflect his views. He told them that he did need their support. The next day, those same men marched alongside Dr. King. That march changed everything. For the first time, the Vice Lords weren't being seen as outlaws, they were being seen as organizers. Civil rights groups from across the country began traveling to North Lawndale to meet them. The Deacons of Defense, RAM, ACT, ACT. They came to the Vice Lords' new clubhouse at 3655 West 16th Street, a pool hall that Pep and the older Lords had opened with their own money, scraped together from years of hustling. It became the first legitimate conservative Vice Lord building in history. No government money, no charity, just the Lords investing in their own community. Then came the brutal Chicago winter of 1967. Blizzards buried the city, paralyzing the streets and trapping everyone indoors. With no cars moving and no police presence, young Vice Lords fled into the frozen streets, looting stores and breaking into Jewish-owned businesses. Even some older Lords joined in. The spree brought heavy negative attention. It pushed more business owners out of North Lawndale, but it also forced a reckoning. Commander Sims, determined to prevent a repeat of last summer's chaos, called a meeting with Vice Lord leaders. Also present that day was David Dawley, a young white researcher from Massachusetts representing a trans-century corporation. He had been sent to cities across the country to study poverty and community reform. Dawley moved into North Lawndale, living among the Vice Lords. He spoke to them, listened to them, and began helping them structure their new movement. Together, they formed Operation Bootstrap, a coalition between the conservative Vice Lords, the Egyptian Cobras, and the Roman Saints. Their mission was simple: to protect their streets and partner with major corporations to prevent riots that could cost Chicago millions. Companies like Sears, Roebuck, Ryerson, Steel, Illinois Bell, and Western Electric all joined hands with Bootstrap. Throughout the summer of 1967, these gangs, once sworn enemies, patrolled their neighborhoods together. They broke up fights, shut down gang meetings, and even stopped the Black Panthers from planning destructive protests. That summer could have exploded into another riot, but it didn't. The street stayed calm because the Vice Lords had found a bigger purpose. Years of rebellion between 1958 and 1964 had left deep scars. The lords had fought the system, the police, and each other. But by the mid-60s, they were starting to realize that violence wasn't the answer. Fighting the government hadn't brought freedom, it had only brought more poverty, more pain, and more death. Now, their mission had evolved to rebuild their communities, create black-owned businesses, and bring jobs and stability to North Lawndale. They wanted to prove that strength could mean more than war, it could mean unity. In the summer of 1967, Alderman George Collins made a promise. If the vice lords could keep riots off the streets, he would help them open an ice cream parlor, a legitimate business that could employ local youth. The lords delivered. That September, Collins kept his word, officially incorporating CVL Inc. as a nonprofit organization. By fall, they opened their first storefront at 16th and Lawndale. It was the start of a new chapter. Meanwhile, Dawley's report to the Trans-Century Corporation and his negotiations with the YMCA led to the creation of Teen Town, a youth center designed to give neighborhood kids an alternative to gang life. The Rockefeller Foundation eventually funded the $15,000, 0 cents needed to open it. Teen Town was set to debut on April 4, 1968, a day that was supposed to mark a turning point for the West Side. But that same night, news broke that Jonathan Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. Within hours, the city erupted. Fires raged across Chicago's west side as people looted and destroyed everything in sight. The vice lords didn't take part, but they didn't stop it either. To them, the store owners had never shown gratitude for what the lords did the summer before, so they stood back, protecting only Teen Town and their pool hall as the rest of the neighborhood burned. When the smoke cleared, the lords set up a relief center at 3720 West 16th Street, handing out food and supplies to hundreds of displaced families. They wrote letters to Mayor Richard J. Daley pleading for support to rebuild North Lawndale, but the city never responded. Still, money came from other sources. Between 1968 and 1969, the vice lords received grants from private and federal programs, $25,000, 0 cents from the Field Foundation, $130,000, 0 cents from the Ford Foundation, $36,000, 0 cents from the Department of Labor, and $60,000, 0 cents from W. Clement Stone. With that money, they built real businesses. Teen Town at 3700 West 16th, the African Lion at 3702, the House of Lords at 3724, Art and Soul at 3742, and even a Tasty Freeze on Pulaski. They partnered with celebrities like Sammy Davis Jr. on ventures like Simone, a beauty brand for African American women. They created programs to clean streets, rehab buildings, plant gardens, and educate tenants on their housing rights. For the first time, the vice lords weren't just talking about change, they were building it. By the end of the decade, North Lawndale felt different. Residents could walk freely wearing jewelry without fear. Violence had dropped. The vice lords act as protectors rather than predators. Newspapers began printing stories about their transformation, how one of Chicago's most feared street gangs had turned into a legitimate community force. But not everyone was convinced. Mayor Daley had declared a war on gangs in 1969, and to him, a gang was a gang, no exceptions. His administration lumped the vice lords together with the Black P-Stones, who were under federal investigation for misusing government funds. Even though the vice lords had never been convicted of such corruption, their funding was cut off too. The city made no distinction between reformers and criminals. The same organization that once patrolled its streets to prevent riots, clean neighborhoods, and offered jobs to its people was now left with nothing. Yet their story of transformation, rebellion, and survival remained one of Chicago's most misunderstood chapters. The vice lords' transformation from a community-minded organization to a group under growing suspicion marked the beginning of their decline. By the late 1960s, federal law enforcement grouped them alongside Chicago's most violent street gangs, ignoring the internal efforts of the conservative vice lords to bring structure and peace to the West Side. Crime statistics painted the area as chaotic, but the vice lords argued that they were being misrepresented. They weren't the ones driving the violence, at least not the faction operating under the conservative banner. What they needed, they said, was time. Time to reshape a generation. Time to turn young men from the streets toward opportunity. But time wasn't something the city was willing to give. Their leaders reached out repeatedly to the mayor's office, requesting support for youth programs, jobs, and recreation centers. Letters went unanswered. Invitations ignored. Mayor Richard J. Daley never once stepped into the Vice Lord's clubhouse, despite being asked. To him and the city's elite, the Vice Lords were too far gone, criminals dressed as reformers. Meanwhile, millions of dollars in urban renewal funds were flowing into the West Side, but those dollars were controlled by city bureaucrats who had no understanding of the community's real needs. The Vice Lords believed they could have done more with that money. They lived the struggle, they knew what would work, but every plea fell on deaf ears. Even when funding reached their orbit, it often came through the wrong hands. Outside groups like Bootstrap mismanaged resources, sparking anger and confusion. Sometimes the money went to low-level vice lords who lacked the education or vision to follow the organization's community agenda. Funds were mishandled, salaries were drawn, and the credibility of the movement began to crack. What started as a mission for reform was slowly becoming tangled in politics, bureaucracy, and greed. By 1968, the struggle for control over the streets had shifted west to the Austin neighborhood, the last predominantly white stronghold on Chicago's west side. White families had resisted change for years, but as African American families began moving in around Jackson Boulevard and Cicero Avenue, tension erupted. The first waves of white flight began in 1966. Small at first, then accelerating through 1967, the dividing line ran along the railroad tracks separating Austin from West Garfield Park. One side white, the other black. Young African Americans trying to walk through the neighborhood were met with fists, bottles, and sometimes worse. Entire gangs of white teenagers patrolled the streets, some backed by older men who refused to see their community change color. By the summer of 1968, the pressure cooker exploded. South and Central Austin were transforming block by block. Columbus Park was now majority African American, though white gangs still dominated the area. Along Cicero and Chicago Avenue, the battles were daily, bricks flying, bats swinging, and knives flashing. Outnumbered and underarmed, black youths needed protection. That's when the conservative vice lords authorized new chapters to establish a foothold. They joined forces with groups like the Four Corner Hustlers and sometimes the Black Pea Stones to fight back. What began as racial conflict soon shifted inward as those same gangs later turned on each other for power and territory. By the end of the 1960s, the Vice Lords had cemented themselves in Austin. From Jackson Boulevard to the Eisenhower Expressway, from Chicago Avenue up to Superior, they were a permanent force. They weren't the largest gang in the area, but they were among the most deeply rooted. Through the 1970s, they learned to turn the chaos into profit, evolving into one of Austin's most consistent money-making crews. By the early 2000s, they had expanded north past North Avenue, where their names still carry weight, a legacy stretching across decades of struggle and survival. While the West Side was hardening under the pressure of racial conflict, the North Side's Uptown neighborhood was changing in its own way. Uptown had been a poor, mostly white enclave for decades, home to Appalachian migrants and Native Americans struggling to get by. But in 1969, everything began to shift. African American students were being bused across the city to send high school, and some families decided to move closer to the school instead of sending their kids across town. They found cheap housing in Uptown, small apartments along Winter Avenue near Lawrence, and unknowingly stepped into a brewing gang war. The Black Gangster Disciples, then known as the Supreme Gangsters, had already planted themselves at Lawrence and Winthrop. It was historic ground, the same area where Chicago's earliest black families had settled decades earlier. Not far away, at Hazel and Agatite, more black families were moving in, joined by struggling Hispanic families seeking affordable housing. From this mix of poverty and survival, the conservative Vice Lords formed their Uptown set in 1969. They were hard-edged, disciplined, and proud of their name. Their first battles came against the Harrison Gents, a local gang that had deep roots in those same buildings and had started recruiting black and Hispanic youth. By the 1970s, the Uptown Vice Lords shifted into the drug trade, turning the neighborhood's desperation into steady income. But Uptown's landscape was changing again. More Hispanic gangs were arriving. The Latin Kings and the Brazers moved into nearby blocks, sparking a new wave of conflicts. Fights broke out in the hallways and courtyards of Hazel and Agatite, where alliances shifted like sand. The Harrison Gents and Latin Kings even joined forces at one point, trying to wipe out the Vice Lords completely, but they couldn't. The CVLs dug in and held their ground. When the People Nation Alliance formed in the 1980s, it created a fragile peace between the Latin Kings and the Vice Lords. Together they turned their guns on the Harrison Gents, who were eventually pushed out of Uptown. By the late 1990s, the gents were gone, their old buildings demolished or replaced by newer developments. But the vice lords remained, moving into renovated apartments, blending into gentrified streets, and keeping a quiet but firm hold over their old territory. The neighborhood had changed, but the Uptown lords never disappeared. In the late 1960s, as Chicago's west side was reshaped by poverty, migration, and police pressure, the vice lords' influence began to spill beyond city limits, reaching smaller Illinois cities where racial tension and economic despair were just as heavy. In Rockford, a city long divided by race and class, African Americans had lived on the west side since the 1910s. Men and women who worked in the Southside factories built their own homes from scraps and endured a quiet kind of segregation. White neighborhoods in the north, east, and south of Rockford guarded their boundaries fiercely, while white youth groups and even grown men harassed black residents who dared to cross invisible lines. But when new waves of young men began arriving from Chicago in the late 1960s, harder, sharper, and less willing to back down, the tone of the streets changed. These weren't locals accustomed to swallowing humiliation, they fought back. Soon, black families from Chicago were settling in Rockford in growing numbers, transforming the west side block by block. On the south side, however, in the tight-knit Italian neighborhoods that also housed members of the Rockford Mafia, survival was even harder. There, only a handful of black families moved in, often met with violence and hostility. But among them came Chicago's street organizations, bringing with them the same rivalries that had shaped the city's gangland politics. By 1969, the Black Gangster Disciples moved into the West Side projects and quickly took over most of the public housing buildings. The conservative vice lords weren't far behind. They moved into the same complexes, sparking a war that would define Rockford's gang culture for decades. Outnumbered but unbroken, the CVLs held their ground through years of conflict, especially in the Concord Commons apartments, which became one of the strongholds. On the southwest side, they pushed deeper into the Italian-dominated blocks around Island Avenue, holding their territory despite constant fights with the Disciples. By the 1980s, alliances shifted. People Nation gangs like the Four Corner Hustlers, Mafia Insane Vice Lords, and Latin Kings initially supported the CVLs, but those relationships collapsed in the 1990s, leaving the lords surrounded by rivals. Still, they spread across new housing projects, particularly in the Fairgrounds projects on the east side of the tracks. Even after those buildings were vacated, the Vice Lord's legacy stayed burned into Rockford streets. Then came a different kind of war, one fought not on the corners, but in the courts. In November 1969, Bobby Gore, the respected leader of the conservative Vice Lords, was arrested and charged with murder. His trial in early 1970 was rushed, his motions for more time denied, his defense barely able to prepare. It was clear the system had already made up his mind. Gore was convicted and sent away, a devastating blow to the Vice Lords movement. It would take more than a decade before the conviction was overturned in 1981, but by then, the damage was done. With Gore gone, CVL Inc., the formal, community-oriented branch of the organization, struggled to survive. From 1969 to 1973, they still tried to push positive initiatives, joining forces with the Black P. Stones and Gangster Disciples under the List Coalition under the Lord Stones and Disciples to advocate for black employment rights. But by the early 1970s, headlines began shifting again toward violence. Some of the worst cases came from splinter factions, the executioner Vice Lords who dabbled in murder for hire, and the unknown traveling into Cicero Vice Lords who turned back to the streets. Still, the conservative Vice Lords of North Lawndale tried to stay clean, distancing themselves from the rising heroin trade that was devouring the West Side. But the epidemic was too strong, and as heroin flooded Chicago's streets, even the boundaries between Vice Lord factions began to blur. One by one, the movement's pillars fell. Co-founder Leonard Calloway was convicted of murder in 1970. In 1972, another key figure, Kenneth Goat Parks, was caught using stolen U.S. Treasury checks. By then, David Dawley, the white social worker who had helped formalize CVL Inc., had returned east. The group's influence, once powerful enough to draw national attention, was collapsing under arrests, mistrust, and addiction. And yet, in 1973, Dawley returned to Chicago with his book, A Nation of Lords. The release briefly reignited hope. For a moment, the Vice Lords were back in the news for the right reasons, but it didn't last. In 1974, President Alfonso Alfred was shot 3 times near his home. He survived but stepped down, leaving a vacuum of leadership. Soon after, CVL Inc. dissolved completely. The once vibrant businesses they'd built in North Lawndale, stores, clubs, and a community pool hall at 3655 West 16th Street, shut down or fell into decay. The same streets that had once represented pride and progress now became open-air drug markets, littered with needles and broken glass. The fall of CVL Inc. wasn't caused by greed or failure alone. It was driven by systematic targeting. In the early 1970s, law enforcement agencies launched sweeping crackdowns on black street organizations, locking up every major leader they could, often on shaky charges. Many, like Gore, were railroaded. The result was a city stripped of leadership, replaced by chaos. By the mid-1970s, new vice lord territories began appearing again, this time in West Humboldt Park. The area had shifted races multiple times, first white, then Puerto Rican, then black. With the streets between Chicago Avenue and Division Street wide open after police crackdowns, the vice lords moved in. Their strongest set formed near Ohio and Hamlin, extending their reach from Augusta to Franklin. Here, they battled Hispanic gangs, Latin kings, Spanish cobras, maniac Latin disciples, and imperial gangsters, as well as black gangster disciples moving in from nearby blocks. 1975 marked the beginning of a long, unbroken vice lord legacy in Humboldt Park. That same year, a young vice lord known as Straw, once a Pee Wee member from the West Side, moved south to the Roseland neighborhood. Surrounded by Black P. Stones and gangster disciples, he planted the flag for the first conservative vice lord set on the South Side at 113th and Edbrook, gathering in Palmer Park. What began as a handful of defiant youths in 1976 grew into a lasting chapter that still survives in Roseland streets today. By 1979, another frontier opened, the Howard Street corridor along the Chicago-Evanston border. When the state's early prison release program flooded Illinois with ex-convicts to reduce overcrowding and costs, new gangs spread into previously quiet neighborhoods. Low-income housing and halfway homes along Howard Street became breeding grounds for transplanted crews. The black gangster disciples arrived first, taking the Juneway Terrace area in Rogers Park. Soon, the conservative vice lords followed, establishing themselves in apartment blocks on both the Chicago and Evanston sides of the border. They fought the disciples, then the Black P. Stones, carving out a territory that would survive decades of shifting demographics and redevelopment. That same year, the ripple reached Joliet, another industrial city south of Chicago. Through the same release program, members of the Latin Kings, Disciples, 2-6, and conservative vice lords were dropped into the East Side's public housing. There, the CVLs clashed with the GDs for control of Fairmont, known locally as the Hill. Over the decades, the vice lords spread toward Broadway Street near the Crest Hill border, a line that would later see bloodshed and police raids. By the end of the 1970s, the reach of the conservative vice lords had quietly extended far beyond Chicago's decaying West Side blocks. What began as a street movement claiming community pride and reform had evolved into a powerful and complex network, one that followed the migration of poverty, displacement, and returning inmates into the suburbs. In Bolingbrook and Woodridge, that expansion took on a raw, survivalist edge. By 1979, African-American families were moving into low-income apartment complexes, and with them came the CVLs, along with their longtime rivals, the Gangster Disciples. These weren't big city towers anymore. They were clusters of modest townhomes and parking lots that quickly turned into contested territory. The violence was personal, fast, and often unpredictable. Local residents told stories of ambushes, stabbings, and chaotic street fights that spread through places like the Fernwood townhouses or the now demolished Innsbrook apartments. The CVLs who operated here weren't trying to make headlines. They were trying to stake permanence. By the early 1980s, they had done just that. A little further north, in Palatine, a suburb most outsiders saw as safe, distant, and orderly, the same pattern repeated. On the far northeast side stood Rand Grove, a cluster of public housing units built in 1973 that quickly spiraled into crime and neglect. By 1979, the CVLs and Latin Kings had divided the projects between them. Kings on the south, vice lords on the north. The uneasy peace of the People Alliance lasted through most of the 1980s until new factions appeared, bringing the gangster disciples into the mix. Wars erupted across the complex. Small, close-quarters conflicts fought between buildings and parking lots and along sidewalks. By the end of the decade, the vice lords were no longer outsiders. They had become part of the permanent landscape of Palatine's underground life. Even further out, in Lake County, the same storm brewed under a different sky. Between 1979 and 1982, a wave of faculty closures gutted Waukegan, North Chicago, and Zion. White flight stripped these towns of resources, and when the Illinois prison release program hit, thousands of ex-inmates needed somewhere to go. They went north to public housing complexes, Marion Jones in North Chicago, Hebron in Zion, Barwell Manor, and Armory Terrace in Waukegan, filled with returning men who brought their city affiliations with them. The conservative vice lords and the gangster disciples quickly took control of these areas, clashing violently for dominance in neighborhoods that still bear those scars today. Closer to Chicago, Maywood and Bellwood became another front. The late 1970s saw new racial tension as Latin King factions in nearby Melrose Park began targeting African American youths. Newspaper reports from 1978 captured stories of teenagers being harassed at gunpoint. Neighborhoods split by fear. Out of that pressure, Chicago's gangs began moving west. Black Peace Stones, Disciples, and the Vice Lords among them. The CVLs established a deep foothold in Maywood and Bellwood, but the violence eventually cooled. Over time, those neighborhoods became a mixture of family homes and quiet corners that still whispered the Vice Lord name. Even Kane County, far from the city's shadows, wasn't untouched. When ex-cons and struggling families from Chicago began resettling in Aurora and Elgin around 1980, they brought the street culture with them. The CVLs moved into public housing, facing off against gangster disciples and maniac Latin disciples. To the untrained eye, these were just ordinary suburban developments, but behind closed doors, the cycle of gang identity, loyalty, and retaliation repeated with the same intensity as it had in Chicago decades earlier. Meanwhile, back in the city, another shift was underway, one that would send shockwaves across all street organizations. Between 1979 and 1981, Jeff Fort, the once revered founder of the Black Peace Stones and now leader of the E.L. Rukns, grew furious with what his old creation had become. The BPSN had splintered into chaos, and Fort's new movement viewed most of the Stones, still using the name, as imposters. Police and the media kept confusing their actions. Crimes committed by one faction were blamed on another. Fort saw this as an insult, a threat to his control. By 1979, his patience had run out. He issued what became known as the E.L. Rukn Sanctions, a decree that stripped the remaining BPSN groups of legitimacy. Any gang still claiming the Stone name without Ford's blessing would face deadly consequences. Some leaders folded their sets and left the streets. Others tried to keep the Stone name alive, defying Ford's command, and paid the price for it. From Chicago's crumbling tenements to its spreading suburbs, the late 70s and early 80s marked the transformation of street gangs into something far more organized and enduring. By 1980, Chicago streets were changing, and so were the Vice Lords. The once Westside-born organization was no longer confined to its old blocks. It was adapting, expanding, and planting roots across the Southside, deep inside the city's crumbling neighborhoods and forgotten suburbs. The transformation was violent, calculated, and inevitable, a survival mechanism in a city where power was always up for grabs. It began unexpectedly in the heart of downtown Chicago, inside the decaying walls of the Oriental Theater. Once a palace for the city's elite, by the 1960s, it had become a gritty refuge for street hustlers and gang members seeking a dark escape. Old gangster films flickered on the screen while real gangsters sat in the seats. Vice Lords, E.L. Rukns, Stones, what started as whispers and stares turned into open conflict. Undercover cops began frequenting the place, watching as tensions thickened between the West Side Vice Lords and the South Side E.L. Rukns. Then, on December 8, 1980, it exploded. 75 or more gang members filled the theater that night. Fists, guns, chaos. By the time it was over, one man was dead. The Oriental shut its doors soon after. The shooting became more than just an incident. It symbolized the birth of something new, the rise of the South Side Vice Lords. Within a year, that energy shifted south to 75th and Cottage Grove. This was Gangster Disciple and Black Peace Stone territory, carved up long before the Vice Lords arrived. But as the Stones' war with the E.L. Rukns raged, they invited the CVLs in. Allies from the west side trusted under the People Nation Alliance. The Vice Lords accepted, setting up a base that became known as Fifth City. From here, the Southside CVLs grew fast, establishing order, structure, and leadership. They spread into Roseland's Wild 100 and further east into the Gardens. But alliances never lasted long in Chicago. As power shifted, old friendships turned to rivalries. By the mid-1980s, the CVLs and Stones were at war again. This time over the very neighborhoods they once shared. One of their strongest strongholds became Altgeld Gardens, a sprawling public housing project on the city's far south side. By 1981, Altgeld was falling apart. Poverty, job loss, and rising crime had stripped it bare. The conservative vice lords seized the moment. They took over nearly half the complex, controlling blocks 1 through 7 and 11 through 17, a massive stretch from 133rd to 134th Street. It became a fortress, a meeting ground for the entire Southside CVL command. Young leaders like Terrell Southside Rel rose through these ranks, eventually becoming chief of all Southside operations. But success brought enemies. By the early 1990s, the Black Disciples encroached on CVL buildings, triggering brutal wars that filled the projects with blood and sent generations to prison. Still, even today, the Vice Lord presence in Altgeld hasn't completely vanished. Farther east, the neighborhood of South Chicago was unraveling. The steel mills had closed, jobs were gone, and a violent drug economy filled the void. The area became a racial fault line, Black and Hispanic gangs drawing invisible borders on every block. Among them, the conservative vice lords carved out territory under the banners of Triple B's at 81st and Muskegon and Death Row around 85th and Escanaba. These were not just crews, they were extensions of the Southside CVL leadership. For decades, those corners would remain under the 5-point star. At the same time, West Englewood became another base of operation. A man known only as June founded the Vice Lords, set at 60th and Winchester in 1981. The group fought hard to defend its turf, wedged between rival Black P. Stones and Disciples. Through the 1980 and 1990, they were a force, small, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. Until time and attrition thinned their ranks. Across the city, new Vice Lord outposts were forming in unexpected places. In the Clare Courts, a quiet project on the edge of a mostly white Midway neighborhood, CVL settled alongside other People Nation gangs, Stones, Four Corner Hustlers, and Mafia Insanes. These were old school men, many freshly released from prison under Illinois' 1979 to 1982 early release program. For years, they lived in relative peace, even forming a rare alliance with the Insane Popes, a white gang that would be formally drafted into the People Nation in 1981. But when crack cocaine hit the streets in the late 80s, that peace broke. The drug trade consumed the Clare Courts, turning allies into competitors and drawing in violence that lasted until the buildings were demolished. Nearby, the Washington Park projects at 44th and 45th became another Vice Lord hub, a dense, dangerous complex shared by multiple 5-point star gangs. CVLs, Insane Vice Lords, Mafia Insanes, and Mickey Cobras all coexisted there. When the projects were finally torn down in 2002, they left behind a void filled with silence and memory. Back on the west side, Rockwell Gardens, once a hopeful housing project, had descended into chaos by 1981. Gangs controlled nearly every building, and money flowed through the drug trade like blood through veins. Here, the conservative vice lords ruled with the traveling vice lords, sharing space and profit. They fought when they had to, cooperated when it paid better. For years, Rockwell was a vice lord paradise, violent, rich, and untouchable, until its demolition in the 2000s erased what was left of that empire. Beyond the city limits, the vice lord's reach kept spreading, following migration patterns, poverty, and prison releases. In Kankakee, former factory towns hollowed out by the early 80s recession became new breathing grounds. CVLs arrived by 1985, recruiting heavily in the north central side as displaced Chicago families moved in. In Hanover Park, low-income apartments became battlegrounds where CVLs teamed with Latin Kings to fight off Disciples and Spanish Cobras. By 1988, the CVLs pushed west into Stringwood, turning McCool Avenue into a war zone. Police crackdowns in 1996 finally dismantled their operations, but the memory of those violent years never left. Even in Glendale Heights, a seemingly quiet suburb, CVLs clashed with gangster disciples throughout the late 1980s and into the mid-1990s. By the 2000s, the gang had faded from sight, but their legacy still lingers in the stories of residents who lived through those years. By the mid-1980s, the Vice Lords had fully transformed from a street brotherhood to a decentralized network stretching across Illinois. Every housing project, every suburban apartment complex carried echoes of the same story: survival through structure, expansion through necessity, and identity carved into concrete. The Vice Lords had started as an idea, unity and self-determination born in the depths of Chicago's West Side. By 1985, that idea had mutated into an empire. By the early 1990s, the landscape of Chicago's western suburbs was changing. Cicero, once a blue-collar stronghold with a notorious reputation for racism and segregation, was on the edge of transformation. For decades, African Americans were unwelcome there, harassed, or worse if they tried to move in. But as the 1980s ended and white flight accelerated, a new population began to take over. By 1992, the streets of Cicero were filled with Hispanic families, many arriving from Chicago's Little Village, Pilsen, and Lawndale neighborhood. The town had always been soaked in gang culture. In earlier decades, it was dominated by white gangs. Names like the 12th Street Players, Noble Knights, and Archdukes ruled the corners. But by the early 90s, the Archdukes had vanished, leaving the Players and Knights struggling to survive. To stay alive, they began recruiting heavily from the growing Hispanic population, reshaping the old white gang scene into a Latino one. African Americans, meanwhile, remained cautious about moving into Cicero. The scars of its violent racial history, from the 1951 Cicero riot to decades of police harassment, still ran deep. But a small number of black families did make the move, settling into a town still learning to coexist with change. Among them came the conservative Vice Lords who saw an opportunity. The CVLs brought something Cicero's African-American youth had never had before: a sense of identity and structure in a place that didn't welcome them. They began establishing sets quietly in apartment complexes and around the West End, recruiting young black teens who were isolated in a town dominated by Hispanic and white cliques. Over time, their presence solidified. The conservative Vice Lords of Cicero became a voice and a shield for the small black community there, one that would last for decades. Even now, long after many of the old names faded from the streets, the CVL imprint in Cicero still lingers, tucked between shifting demographics and forgotten history. Across the United States, the Vice Lords had grown into something much larger than a Chicago gang. By the 1990s, the Vice Lord Nation had exploded into a network of more than 25,000 members, and that was just a conservative estimate. These weren't all under one centralized command. Far from it. Each branch, conservative, traveling, unknown, four-corner hustlers, mafia insanes, operated like its own independent syndicate. Together, they formed what was called the Almighty Vice Lord Nation, but on the streets, unity was a fragile idea. The Vice Lords functioned differently than any other organization in Chicago. Where the Black Disciples, Gangster Disciples, or Black Peace Stones often maintained hierarchies under one name, the Vice Lords were fractured. A network of war-torn families sharing the same flag, but rarely the same peace. Most factions didn't answer to one supreme leader. Power shifted block to block, prison to prison, decade to decade. Even when hostilities cooled in the late 1970s or early 80s, each Vice Lord faction still guarded its own autonomy, its own streets, its own profits, its own laws. The only place the Almighty Nation truly came alive was behind bars. Inside Illinois prisons, the divisions dissolved. Under the pressure of survival, all Vice Lords, no matter their set, united under one creed, one nation, and one alliance, the People Nation. Behind the walls, the 5-point star was sacred. On the streets, it was fragmented, respected, but never absolute. Despite the infighting, the Vice Lords' philosophy remained rooted in money, power, and pragmatism. They weren't obsessed with color codes or rigid allegiance to the People Nation's politics. They were businessmen before soldiers, willing to align with anyone who brought peace and profit. On 47th and Damon, Vice Lords maintained an unusual alliance with the 2-6, a folk nation gang. Over on Costner and Congress, they shared corners with Gangster Disciples, another folk rival, not out of loyalty but out of mutual understanding. The Land Counts became the Vice Lords' most loyal Hispanic allies, a partnership that still runs deep across generations. That alliance dictated much of their diplomacy. The Vice Lords would refuse any dealings with enemies of the Counts, bishops, many Southside Latin kings, and others. They also maintained a strong bond with the insane unknowns, particularly the unknown vice lords, solidifying a rare cross-gang brotherhood. But because of that connection, vice lords clashed bitterly with the Spanish lords, who opposed the unknowns. Among Hispanic folk gangs, several were off limits entirely. La Raza, Spanish Gangster Disciples, Saint Disciples, Brazers, and Ambrose, each considered hostile or untrustworthy. On the other hand, the vice lords' ties with the Latin Council extended into alliances with the Southside insane popes, saints, and Latin brothers, all bound by years of loyalty and mutual enemy. There was no single black gang that the vice lords considered a sworn full-time enemy. Their wars were fluid, based on economics, territory, and shifting alliances rather than deep ideological divides. For the vice lords, everything came down to the street code: respect, profit, and survival. In a city built on segregation and betrayal, the vice lords learned to adapt to both. By the time the vice lords spread beyond Chicago's borders, they had become both a symbol of fear and of misunderstood potential. What began on the west side streets of North Lawndale as a neighborhood defense crew evolved into one of America's largest street organizations. But deep beneath the violence and headlines was a philosophy that wasn't built on crime at all. According to true vice lord doctrine, the almighty vice lord nation was never meant to thrive on drugs or bloodshed. Since the late 1960s, the core belief written, preached, and passed down condemned criminal acts. The idea was empowerment through community control, not destruction. But in the real world, the doctrine and the streets rarely followed the same path. In neighborhoods drowning in poverty and neglect, young black men often saw crime as the only way to survive. For many, the gang was not rebellion, it was necessity. The original leaders, men like Bobby Gore, Pepperlo Perry, and Willie Lloyd, saw this long before it spiraled out of control. They witnessed the world collapsing around them. Crumbling housing, failing schools, and a city government that refused to care. They realized that if they wanted to save their neighborhoods, they had to become more than just soldiers. They had to become builders. By 1964, the Conservative Vice Lords Inc. was reborn, not as a street gang, but as a social movement. Their headquarters on 16th Street in North Lawndale became a center of progress. Businesses owned by black youth, art programs, job fairs, and open houses that welcomed anyone, even white residents and city officials, to see what transformation looked like. CVL Inc. became a father figure to a fatherless generation, teaching discipline, pride, and responsibility. Then came September 11, 1967, when CVL Inc. officially incorporated, a move that marked one of the most radical social experiments in Chicago history. The goal was no longer just saving Lawndale, it was saving the entire west side, then the city, and maybe even the country. They wanted to unite all poor people regardless of race. For a moment it worked, but that hope never sat well with power. Mayor Richard J. Daley, Chicago's political titan, ignored every invitation from CVL Inc. He never visited their centers, never acknowledged the transformation. Perhaps, as some believed, he didn't want to see a gang succeed where the city had failed. Daley's administration wanted control, not partnership. So when the war on gangs began in 1969, the city lumped CVL Inc. together with the most violent factions in Chicago. The same organization that once held suit drives and youth programs was now branded a threat. Government funding was pulled, grants dried up, and within years, the dream collapsed. By 1974, after the death of Alfonso Alford, CVL Inc. was gone. 16th Street, once filled with businesses and color, became a wasteland of abandoned buildings and boarded up storefronts. The beret-wearing sentries who once patrolled to protect their neighbors were replaced by corner dealers guarding dope spots. Where there was once life, there was now decay. But this fall wasn't just the community's fault. The truth is, it takes money to rebuild, and North Lawndale never had it. Banks redlined the neighborhood, denying loans. City funds were diverted elsewhere. Employers refused to hire anyone from a gang neighborhood. Even when men wanted to work, their zip code wrote their fate. Get a job, people said. But the system had already locked the doors. Ironically, Many of the same gangs labeled as society's curse became the only places teaching real-world survival, how to talk in an interview, how to write a resume, how to hustle within or beyond the law. Inside prisons, rehabilitation programs and gang mentorship often gave members the discipline and skill set the city never offered them outside. It was twisted, but it was reality. In the 1960s, vice lords had fought for that very change through movements like the LSD Coalition, Lords, Stones, and Disciples, demanding jobs, housing, and dignity. And though some factions fell into drugs and violence, others still clung to that vision, turning their power into progress. The vice lords were, and still are, a mirror of their environment. They rose from streets controlled by chaos, fighting first for survival, then for respect, then for change. Their mission was to reclaim every block so that no child had to hide from another gang's shadow. And for a brief, shining moment, they nearly succeeded. Even today, many elder vice lords remain law-abiding men, mentors trying to guide a younger generation away from the path they once walked. Their message is simple: the old doctrine still lives. It just doesn't make the news anymore. The Vice Lord Nation has spread far beyond Chicago, into nearly every major city in America, and even into middle-class suburbs once thought untouchable. From Naperville to Downers Grove, teenagers with no real connection to Lawndale now throw up the V, echoing a name that once stood for something deeper than violence. One of the founders, Kenneth Goat Parks, saw it coming decades ago. They're gonna wake up one morning, he warned, and they're gonna stand the dragon, spitting that fire, and they're gonna be throwing buckets of water, but it's gonna be too late. That dragon, crack cocaine, guns, and greed, did arrive. It burned through the city, through generations, and into the suburbs, all because when the vice lords tried to build, the system refused to listen. And that, more than anything, is the tragedy of the vice lords. Not that they became a gang, but that when they tried not to be one, no one believed them.